At 65, Richie Sambora finally breaks his silence on Bon Jovi. He stood a few feet from the most famous voice in rock and roll for 30 years, and then one night in April 2013, he simply wasn't there. No goodbye. No press conference. Just an empty spot on the stage where 20,000 people expected to see him. For over a decade, Richie Sambora let the world guess why. He let Bon Jovi fans build their own theories, let tabloids fill in the blanks, let his silence become the loudest part of the story. Then, more than 10 years later, sitting in front of a camera for a documentary about the band he helped build from nothing, he finally said the words fans had been waiting for. He apologized, not for leaving, for how he left, and what he said next changed the way an entire generation of rock fans understood one of the most successful partnerships in music history. Stick around, because by the end of this video you'll understand exactly what really happened between these two Jersey kids who built an empire together, and why, even now, the door between them isn't fully closed. Before there was a stadium-filling band, there were just two ambitious teenagers growing up 20 minutes apart in blue-collar New Jersey. Jon Bon Jovi came out of Sayreville, the kind of town where nobody was handed anything, and Richie Sambora grew up in nearby Woodbridge with the same hunger. Both boys fell in love with guitar-driven rock and roll at a young age, chasing the same dream that thousands of other kids in garage bands up and down the Jersey Shore were chasing too, except these two actually had the drive to see it through. Jon spent his teenage years playing in a band called Atlantic City Expressway and later the Wild Ones, cutting his teeth in local clubs and bars long before anyone outside New Jersey had heard his name. Richie was doing something similar, playing in local groups and building a reputation as one of the most technically gifted young guitarists on the scene. Someone who understood not just how to play fast but how to make a guitar actually say something. Richie officially joined what would become Bon Jovi in 1983, and almost immediately the chemistry between the two of them was obvious to anyone who saw them play. This wasn't just a singer finding a competent guitar player to fill out his lineup. Richie brought a bluesy, soulful sensibility that gave the band's sound texture and depth, something that separated Bon Jovi from a lot of the flashier, more one-dimensional hair metal acts that were flooding MTV at the time. Jon had the voice, the charisma, and the songwriting instincts to write anthems, but it was often Richie's arrangements, harmonies, and guitar work that turned those anthems into something people felt in their chest. Anyone who has ever heard the Talkbox intro on Livin' on a Prayer knows exactly what that partnership sounded like at its best. That single riff, played through a device that makes a guitar sound almost like it's talking, became one of the most recognizable sounds in rock history, and it belonged entirely to Richie. Through the mid to late 1980s, the two of them wrote and recorded some of the most successful rock albums of the decade together. Slippery When Wet turned Bon Jovi from a regional act into a global phenomenon, and New Jersey cemented them as one of the biggest bands on the planet. Behind the scenes, Jon and Richie were writing partners in the truest sense, trading ideas back and forth, finishing each other's musical sentences. Richie has said in later interviews that their creative connection in those early years felt almost telepathic, the kind of shorthand that only comes from spending thousands of hours together in a van, a studio, or a tour bus. Fans who watched them perform night after night saw two men who seemed genuinely inseparable, laughing together backstage, trading looks on stage during solos, playing off each other's energy in a way that can't really be faked over a long enough timeline. But even in those golden years, there was a structural imbalance that would eventually matter a great deal. Jon Bon Jovi was always going to be the face of the band. He was the frontman, the name on the marquee, the one giving most of the interviews and signing most of the endorsement deals. That's simply how rock bands built around a charismatic lead singer tend to work, and in the beginning it didn't seem to bother anyone. Richie was, by his own admission, more comfortable playing a supporting role publicly even as he was doing an enormous amount of the creative heavy lifting privately. For years, that arrangement worked because the trust between them was strong enough to carry the weight of an unequal spotlight. The problem is that trust, once it starts to erode, is very hard to notice from the inside until it's already gone. As Bon Jovi's fame grew through the 1990s and into the 2000s, the machine around the band got bigger, the tours got longer, and the pressure got heavier. Being one of the biggest touring acts in the world sounds like a dream from the outside, but the reality involves years of back-to-back shows, constant travel, very little personal stability, and almost no time to simply be a person outside of the job. Richie has spoken since then about how those years took a toll on him personally, including struggles with substance abuse and the difficulty of going through a very public divorce from actress Heather Locklear, while still being expected to show up every night and perform at full intensity. He wasn't hiding from work. He was trying to hold his personal life together while the band's schedule left almost no room to do so. By the early 2010s, something had shifted. Richie has described feeling like the band had started to operate less like the close creative partnership it began as and more like a business, with decisions being made further away from him than they used to be. That doesn't necessarily mean anyone was acting in bad faith. Bands that reach a certain size often develop that kind of structure almost by necessity, with management, labels, and logistics adding layers between the people actually making the music. But for someone who had been in the room from the very beginning, helping shape nearly every major decision, that shift can feel like a slow-motion demotion even if nobody ever says it out loud. Richie later admitted that toward the end of his time in the band, he sometimes felt more like hired help than like one of the founding members who had built the whole thing from a New Jersey bar stage. Then came April 2013. Bon Jovi was in the middle of their Because We Can World Tour, and hours before a scheduled show in Calgary, the band announced that Richie would not be performing that night, citing personal reasons and giving no further explanation. At the time, almost nobody outside the band's inner circle understood what was actually happening. Fans assumed it might be temporary, maybe a health issue or a family emergency that would resolve itself within a few days. Instead, the tour continued without him, night after night, city after city, and Richie never came back. The band brought in guitarist Phil X to fill the role, and what had started as an unexplained absence slowly hardened into a permanent departure, one that was never formally announced with any real explanation at the time. For a partnership that had defined an entire era of rock and roll, the ending was almost eerily quiet. Jon Bon Jovi has since said publicly and repeatedly that there was no blow-up, no argument, no single moment of conflict that pushed Richie out the door. In interviews tied to the band's 2024 documentary, Jon described it plainly, saying there was never a fight between them, and that Richie was dealing with personal issues that made it difficult for him to keep showing up for the demands of the tour. Jon has framed it less as a betrayal and more as a simple, painful fact of life. Some people reach a point where they can't keep doing what the job requires, no matter how much history or loyalty is involved. He has said he was heartbroken by how it ended, not by the decision to step back itself, but by the abruptness of it, by the fact that one night there was simply a hole where his musical partner used to stand. For Richie's part, the reasons behind his exit turned out to be layered. There was the accumulated exhaustion of decades of non-stop touring. There were personal struggles he was working through privately, including issues with substance use that he has been open about in later interviews. And running through all of it was something that mattered more to him than almost anything connected to the band. His relationship with his daughter, Ava, whom he shares with Heather Locklear. Ava was entering her teenage years, going through her own difficult stretch amid her parents' high-profile divorce, and Richie has said he became increasingly aware that the touring lifestyle was creating real distance between them, the kind of distance that doesn't heal itself once the years are gone. He has talked about not wanting to be, in his words, a ghost in his own daughter's life, and about realizing that no amount of arena applause was worth missing the years she needed him most. In the years immediately following his departure, both men kept an unusually low public profile about each other. There were no tell-all interviews, no public feuding, no dramatic war of words playing out in magazines the way it might have with a lot of other high-profile band breakups. Instead, there was mostly silence, which in its own way said just as much as any argument could have. Fans were left piecing together fragments from occasional interviews, trying to understand a rift that neither man seemed particularly interested in explaining in detail. Jon continued fronting the band with Phil X on guitar, releasing new albums and continuing to tour, while Richie stepped back into a quieter chapter of his life built around solo music, occasional performances, and raising his daughter. That changed in 2024, when Hulu released Thank You, Good Night, The Bon Jovi Story, a documentary chronicling the band's four-decade history. For the first time, Richie sat down and spoke candidly on camera about how he left the band and how he felt about it more than a decade later. He didn't try to rewrite what happened or make excuses for it. He said plainly that he didn't regret the decision to step back from that life, But he did regret the way he handled leaving, admitting that his feet and his spirit simply weren't letting him walk out the door the right way. It was, in effect, a public apology, offered first to the fans who had been left confused and hurt by his sudden absence, and offered just as sincerely to Jon and the rest of the band who had been left to explain his empty spot on stage night after night without him there to explain it himself. Jon's response to that apology, when it came, wasn't bitter and it wasn't triumphant. It was measured, almost gentle. He said he wasn't surprised Richie had finally addressed it, and he made clear there had never been any real animosity between them in the years since, even during the long stretch of silence. Jon described Richie as having personal issues he couldn't quite get past, and said he had encouraged all of his bandmates over the years to bring outside experience back to strengthen the group, but that when Richie chose to step away entirely, there wasn't much left to do but accept it and keep the band moving forward. He was careful to separate his feelings about Richie as a person, whom he still speaks about with clear affection, from his frustration about how the exit unfolded in practice, leaving the band to scramble and the fans without an explanation. What makes this story more complicated than a simple falling out is that both men have continued to change independently in the years since, in ways that make a full reunion far less simple than nostalgia might suggest. Jon Bon Jovi went through a serious health scare involving his vocal cords, a condition that required surgery and a long, difficult recovery process, and one that he has spoken about candidly as reshaping how he thinks about performing at all going forward. That experience appears to have influenced the more reflective, mortality-aware tone of the band's 2024 album Forever, a record that leans into themes of endurance, loss, and what it means to keep going after so many years in an industry built on constant reinvention. Richie, meanwhile, has spent his post-Bon Jovi years focused heavily on solo music and on his role as a father, releasing occasional new material while staying largely out of the spotlight that once defined his daily life. There has also been renewed public attention on the relationship more recently, as Bon Jovi has continued touring without Richie and fans have kept the conversation alive online. Richie has occasionally engaged with fan commentary suggesting that the band isn't quite the same without him, amplifying posts that compare his absence to other iconic bands losing a defining member. It's a reminder that even without a public feud, plenty of fans still feel the absence of that original chemistry. The specific magic that came from two Jersey kids who grew up 20 minutes apart and somehow found exactly the right sound together. Whether that kind of tension reflects genuine friction between the two men or simply reflects how fans process the loss of a beloved lineup is something neither Jon nor Richie has spelled out in detail, and it's worth being cautious about reading too much into secondhand claims or anonymous insider quotes that circulate in tabloid coverage without direct confirmation from either man. As for a full reunion, neither side has closed the door completely, but neither has treated it as a realistic near-term plan either. Jon has generally framed their story as something to be honored rather than reopened, focusing on where the band is now rather than trying to recreate a version of it from 40 years ago. There's a kind of wisdom in that restraint. Reunions built purely on nostalgia don't always hold up to the weight of everything that's changed in the years between, and both men seem aware that whatever made their partnership special in 1986 existed in a very specific time and place that can't simply be summoned back on command. That doesn't mean the door is locked forever. It means that for now, both of them appear to be choosing honesty over spectacle, which might actually be the more meaningful outcome for two men who spent 30 years building something together and then spent another decade figuring out how to be honest about how it ended. What stands out most, looking at everything both men have actually said on the record, is how little of this story matches the kind of dramatic, secret tell-all narrative that tabloid headlines sometimes suggest. There's no smoking gun. There's no betrayal at the center of it. There's just two men who built something extraordinary together, went through the very real strain that comes with decades of fame, family, and personal struggle, and eventually found their way to a more honest, if still incomplete, understanding of each other. Richie Sambora's guitar work is still stitched into the DNA of some of the most beloved rock songs of the last 40 years, and no amount of distance between him and Jon changes what they created together during those years in the studio and on stage. Sometimes the most powerful ending to a story isn't a dramatic reveal. It's just two people finally being honest about how complicated things really were, and choosing, even after everything, not to tear each other down. If this look at the real story behind Bon Jovi's most famous lineup change gave you a new appreciation for what these two built together, let us know your favorite Sambora-era Bon Jovi song in the comments. and subscribe for more honest deep dives into the stories behind the music you grew up on.